the plenary address. And I hand you over to my colleague, Shahid Fauda, who will take over the baton from me. Hi, Shahid.
Morning, Shadrach, and morning, colleagues, presenters, and various organizations represented here today. Today's plenary session will be addressed by Dr. Olga Bialostocka from the Human Sciences Research Council here in South Africa. And her address will be Liberating African Heritage from Modernity through a radical decolonial path. Her paper addresses mainly the conceptual issues around which we need to be cognizant. And I'm looking forward to hearing her thoughts on these matters. Over to Dr. Olga Bialostocka.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It is a great honor and a pleasure for me to be part of this symposium and to address such a distinguished public. I thank the organizers for this privilege. My topic for today, framed by the theme Globality and Universal Relevance, is Liberating African Heritage from Modernity through Radical Decolonial Path. I will start by defining modernity and describing its key characteristics. And then I will speak a little bit about alternative modernities, focusing on their roots and problematizing their conceptualization. I will then have a look at transmodernity as an alternative to modernity, and we link it to the question of values. Finally, I will briefly comment on the category of modern heritage currently used by UNESCO to recommend reframing of the concept to create a new transversal heritage category rooted in decoloniality movement. So what is modernity from a decolonial perspective? There are two theories about the origins of modernity. One, which places its beginnings in the 15th century with the colonization of America by Spain, and we can call it historical modernity. And the other, which sees its origins 2 centuries later, we can call it philosophical modernity. Three key events that announce historical modernity are the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the discovery of the so-called New World, while the philosophical modernity starts with the Reformation, the Enlightenment movement, and the French Revolution. The decolonial school of thought considers the invasion of America by Spain as the geopolitical opening for modernity in the West. It starts, therefore, with the control of the world system and the invention of the colonial system, together with the introduction of capitalism, which over 300 years would progressively shift the political-economic balance in favor of the peripheral and isolated old Europe. Decolonial scholars see modernity, colonialism, the world system, and capitalism as simultaneous and mutually constitutive aspects of the same reality. If we choose to follow this thinking, Spain was actually the first modern nation. The Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment helped modernity reach its maturity in the time when colonialism was being spread to Asia and Africa through Northern European expansion. Historical modernity is therefore not contemporary with the European hegemony. Modern Europe became the center after it was already modern. Europe began to function as the center of the world market with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Modernity is essentially not an exclusively European phenomenon, but rather, and I quote here, a European phenomenon constituted in a dialectical relation with a non-European alterity that is its ultimate content. Europe asserts itself as the core, and that core requires a periphery to exist. This periphery, therefore, constitutes part of Europe's self-definition. The conception of modernity as the pinnacle of a social-cultural progressive transition needed a narrative of difference against which Europe could self-define. And that's how the non-European traditions were invented. Tradition per se does not exist. It was constructed by the rhetoric of modernity. Tradition is not outside modernity, but in its exteriority. It is an outside invented by the rhetoric of modernity in the process of creating the inside. The outside of tradition is invented in order to ensure the inside as the locus of enunciation of knowledge. Accordingly, tradition is not a way of life that predated modernity, but an invention of the rhetoric of modernity. Modernity is typically defined in relation to tradition. Western linear theory of sociocultural transformation clearly divided history into pre-modern period, characterized by immature or primitive state of traditional societies, from modernity, constructed on the premises of rational and scientific thinking, secularization, materialism, individualism, and man's control over nature. Eurocentric binary opposition juxtaposes traditional cultures with their holistic ways of doing things against universal modern culture, which focuses on science, specialization, and spatiotemporal universalism. The Western theoretical understanding of the concepts of modernity and tradition was used as a tool to marginalize and suppress the colonized, seeing traditional communities as in need of being saved, which meant developed from a primitive origin to some utopian end, or lifted up from a state of savagery to civilization. From a Western perspective, then, modernity is constructed as a telos, a supreme end of a human's progressive development. The aim of modernity, defined against tradition, was to dominate the non-European traditions by conversion, civilization, and later by development. Modernity created 4 versions of salvation that are part of its rhetoric. It's salvation through Christianity and civilizing missions, newness or innovation through enlightenment and secular humanism, progress through industrial revolution, and finally development, which is an ongoing economic project of the West. Today, we can say after Escobar that the world has been colonized by the development discourse. All of these versions of salvation are intertwined with the logic of coloniality. Coloniality is therefore constitutive of modernity, and there is no modernity without coloniality. Coloniality is what Mignolo calls dark side of modernity that needs to be exposed because it exists as, and I quote here, an embedded logic that enforces control, domination, and exploitation disguised in the language of salvation, progress, modernization, and being basically good for everyone. A key marker of coloniality is colonial difference, which operates on the ontological and the epistemic levels. By converting differences into values, it establishes a hierarchy of beings, producing superior and inferior human beings, the latter somehow deficient in terms of aesthetics and rational reasoning, hence sometimes called barbarians or primitives. Justified by the naturalization of the racial ranking of human beings, modernity considered some human lives expendable to the benefit of increasing wealth. Hence, we observed slave trade. Mignolo, a decolonial scholar, explains that, and I quote here, the construction of the colonial difference goes hand in hand with the establishment of exteriority. Exteriority is the place in which the outside, inhabited by anthropos, is invented in the process of creating the inside, inhabited by humanitas, to secure the safe space where the enunciator dwells, end of quote. Defined through colonial difference, coloniality itself is composed of 4 mutually articulated domains. Slide, please. The management and control of economy, the control of authority, the control of gender and sexuality, and the control of subjectivity and knowledge. This colonial matrix of power was created at the inception of the modern colonial world and is still upheld today by the underlying racial and patriarchal organization of knowledge making and by capital. This led Grossfogel, another decolonial scholar, to deem today's Euro-North American-centric modernity as a racist, patriarchal, sexist, Christian-centric, heteronormative, capitalist, military, colonial, imperial, and modern form of civilization. It still dictates what knowledge and understanding are, how economy and politics should function, what belongs to ethics and philosophy, what technology means, and how the society should be organized. Questioning the supposedly universal trajectory of economic and social transformations needed to achieve Western modernity, the non-Western countries managed to break out of the modernity telos cage and decided to create their own alternative modernities. These new modernities can emerge by mixing elements of local cultures with ideas or solutions adopted from the global culture. However, cultural hybridities that develop as a result reveal underlying power relations, which direct the way the cultural interaction between the local and the global, the center and the periphery, leads to the process of cultural transformation. With this in mind, Ferguson speaks of a colonial shadow relation between Africa and the West, which persists, having hunted the continent since its independence. It subsists on Africa's aspiration to membership, which depends on the continent's progress towards development and modernity, both of which can be deemed imaginary pursuits. Once modernity lost its appeal as a telos, it started being used simply with reference to some fixed global status, a state of being first class, which may be achieved one day. But as it is no longer a telos, it is not a given that one could expect it as an end result of a gradual rise in the world's socioeconomic hierarchy. Consequently, reaching this highest standard of living becomes more of a distant dream than a promise. Unreachable for most, the status turned into a high-hanging fruit planted by the West. In the pursuit of a higher standard of living associated with modernity, Asian countries focused on transforming their economies, but in line with their local cultural precepts and philosophical standpoints. African cultures have been presented by modernization theorists as a relic and an obstacle to development. Hence, the countries on the continent choose more often to modernize their cultures by eliminating what they deemed backward practices in hope of reaching the status of a modern state. Whatever the trajectory chosen to pursue an alternative modernity, the motivation behind it remains the same, namely an aspiration to membership. It does not question modernity or development as a concept or a path. It simply changes its features. The process of constructing alternative modernities as a way of breaking free from imperial designs can be considered an example of what Mignolo calls de-Westernization. It is a process that does not question the transformation itself, but interrogates the content within the capitalist economy established by the West, demanding the right to shape the properties and modalities of the developmental path to suit the context. They are the product of postmodernism, which, as the final stage of modernity, originated in the European vision of modernity. And as Dassel explained, I quote here, postmodernism proposed the possibility of multicultural communication or dialogue, innocently or cynically presupposing a symmetry between participants, which is non-existent in reality. And I'd like to make here a brief digression with regards to the topic of title of my paper, why I use the word liberation. I use it quite deliberately as I consciously follow here the thinking of decolonial scholars, particularly Enrico Dassel and Walter Mignolo. Liberation is associated with two types of struggle that are interlinked, one of political and economic nature, and the other at the level of epistemology. It was Dassel who chose to attach the word liberation to philosophy, to complementing the meaning the word had in relation to social movements of national liberation in Africa and in Asia, as well as in Latin America. He chose the word liberation over emancipation, which he considers a concept belonging to the discourse of the European Enlightenment. Within this discourse, emancipation carries the promise of changes within the system, but without questioning the logic of coloniality. And thus, for example, the emerging nation states in Europe, though independent, can be seen as new imperial configurations. Liberation and decolonization offer an epistemic shift, while emancipation is still not free from the colonial metrics of power. Emancipating projects of the West are projects of transformation, but within the linear trajectory of Western history and Western thought. And the example of such emancipation by the West may be, for example, the pronouncement of the US to spread democracy in whether the Middle East or Africa, Considering this distinction between liberation and emancipation, the discourse of alternative modernities can be said to belong to the narrative of emancipation as part of the discourse of enlightenment. Like the concept of emancipation itself, these multiple modernities are still entangled in coloniality. And that path, which Mignolo calls de-Westernization, is being forcefully argued by Singaporean scholar Kishore Mahbubani, among others. And in India, this direction is also very strong. But the mistake is that in this case, modernity is being understood as beginning with the Enlightenment. And if we consider that the racial hierarchization introduced with the colonization of America, we understand that already during Enlightenment, the local populations of Africa or of the colonized territories were not considered as humans. Hence, they were not included into the Enlightenment movement, which targeted only humanitas. Expressions such as alternative modernities, subaltern modernities, or peripheral modernities were introduced to account for modernity, but from non-European perspectives. All of them have one common problem. These narratives and arguments maintain the centrality of Euro-American modernity, assuming one modernity of reference and putting themselves in subordinate positions. All of these alternative or peripheral, subaltern, alter modernities also reproduce the vexing question of modernity and tradition. There is a need, therefore, to reconstruct modernity from an exterior perspective. That is to say, a global perspective, not provincial like the European perspective, and to look for alternatives to modernity. Mignolo proposes in this case a radical path, the decolonial option of delinking, which questions the rhetoric of capitalist economy in trying to imagine other possibilities, such as regeneration of life. This option undermines the universality of the process of transformation as a whole and its end result. In other words, it neither prescribes the path nor the destination, believing that, and I quote here, there are not only many roads to heaven, but also many heavens. Delinking replaces the discourse of globalization and civilization with mondialization and culture. For unlike globalization, mondialization brings to the fore the manifold local histories that, in questioning global designs, aim at forms of globality that arise out of cultures of transience, that go against the cultural hegemony fostered by such designs. Mignolo argues that if knowledge making is to serve well-being, it shall come from local experiences and needs rather than from local imperial experiences and needs projected to the globe. And that's why the aspiration, of which I just spoke, matters. It is key to deciding on the path, but also, more importantly, on the destination. Imagining different types of modernity or different ways of arriving at modernity does not address the problem of the imaginary construction that modernity is. It presupposes that everyone imagines it in the first place. It is by renouncing the aspiration to membership that one becomes free to choose one's own future, being guided by one's own value system without the burden of someone else's expectation. The suggested renunciation of aspiration as a form of decolonial delinking offers liberation from the discourse of globalization, civilization, which mainstreamed the neoliberal world order, by replacing it with mondialization culture that recognizes a multiplicity of social and economic order. Accordingly, the view that civilization or modernity is the highest point in the linear progressive development trajectory from savagery would lose its merit. Instead, culture in all its diversity will constitute the only reference. Its transformation, marked by both continuity and change, will neither be bound by linear time nor a fixed destination. The artificial Western binary of tradition and modernity would also not hold ground in this case. Decoloniality breaks away with the Eurocentric project of postmodernity. What is proposed instead is a decolonial epistemic shift through delinking from both the rhetoric of modernity and the logic of coloniality. It opens up a way for other epistemologies, other principles of knowledge and understanding, other economy, other politics, other ethics. The linking moves us from the fallacy of universality of European model rooted in capital accumulated as a consequence of colonialism to the geo and body politics of knowledge, meaning the knowledge of a locality. This process enables changing not just the content of the conversation, but the terms on which it is held as a whole. And there were previous attempts at changing the content, such as through Christianity's theory of liberation or the liberalism and Marxism, with which different countries seemingly supported decolonization in Africa and Asia during the Cold War. The linking targets the core on which modernity was built by reconstituting the discussion using epistemologies of the exteriority and of the borders, that is, the outside created by the rhetoric of modernity, and reframing it using geo and body politics of knowledge. That border thinking is what, in the end, connects the diversity of local cultures subjected to the modern world colonization, as this leads to other universality, that is to pluriversality as a universal project. In other words, instead of imagining alternative modernities, we must create alternatives to modernity, born out of the perspectives and consciousnesses of the peripheral cultures. Only then, an intercultural dialogue would be at all possible. So what happens when we delink the rhetoric of modernity from the logic of coloniality? Well, we begin to see that there are other forms of and principles of knowledge that have been colonized, silenced, repressed, and denigrated by the different dimensions of modernity. And we can move further in the direction that Dussel calls transmodernity. So it is not about seeking what is possibly outside of modernity, but rather what belongs to exteriority, which, as I've alluded to earlier, has been created by the project of modernity. Exteriority lies in the border space, the exteriority of modern and the postmodern. That border lies where Western knowledge and subjectivity, control of land and labor, of authority and ways of living, gender and sexuality, have been contacting other languages, memories, principles of knowledge and belief, forms of government and economic organization since 1492. Transmodernity is also not the same as cultural relativism, because each local history today has to deal with the rhetoric of modernity and the logic of coloniality. This is what all the diverse local histories have in common with others, this unavoidable presence of the modern colonial world. The local narratives of decolonization can therefore connect to the common experience and use it as the basis for a new common logic of knowing called border thinking. Okay, I'm being crushed, so maybe I'm going to move now to what transmodernity is. And next slide, please. Transmodernity. So as Dussel explains, if we consider that Europe became the center of the world in the Age of Enlightenment, not at the start of the historical modernity, as explained earlier, its enlightened hegemony lasted merely 2 centuries, during which it was not capable to profoundly transform the soul of ancient and universal cultures like the Chinese, the Islamic cultures, Latin American cultures. These cultures have been partly colonized and their economic and political systems reconfigured to exploit people and accumulate capital, but their cultures, deemed useless, were mostly left out, negated, excluded, which in the end allowed them to survive in silence, simultaneously scorned by their own modernized and westernized elites. This cultural exteriority has obviously not been untouched by modernity, but has been evolving in the face of modernity itself. With their diverse economic and political models, scientific and technological innovations and military conditions, they represent an alterity with respect to European modernity, with which they have coexisted and have learned to respond in their own way to its challenges. Since they are exterior to modernity, they cannot be deemed to be postmodern either. They are simultaneously pre-modern, meaning older than modernity, and contemporary to modernity, and soon to transmodernity. They do not respond to the Western binary of tradition and modernity, but include all of those aspects that are situated beyond and also prior to the structures valorized by modern European, North American culture. These cultures of exteriority speak from the perspective of their own cultural experiences, responding with solutions that could not be imagined within an exclusively modern culture. Transmodern culture, as imagined by the decolonial scholars, assumes the positive moments of modernity, but conscious of existing asymmetries, it holds rich pluriversality, which is the fruit of an authentic intercultural dialogue. And now, when it comes to modern heritage, okay, I'm going to skip the part where I wanted to present modern heritage as a UNESCO category, and now move to my conclusion. So, writing about indigenous modernities, Jyoti Hosagraha noted, it is not to give voice to minority discourses and knowledges in order to include them in their subordinate positions into existing privileged accounts of modernity, but to question the master narrative. Now, which master narrative are we addressing? Alternative modernities question simply the narrative of Western modernity. Transmodernity questions modernity as a concept. The UNESCO category of modern heritage, as it is defined now, is not just exclusionary, but from a decolonial perspective, hides its dark side, coloniality. In this light, the outstanding universal value that the modern heritage sites represent may need to be reassessed. To change the terms, not just the content of the category, would mean not simply to add African modernity as an example of alternative modernities, but rather to enlarge the category by adding or including the excluded, the cultures of the exterior. Just as alternative modernities can only be considered a subcategory of the Western one, which is considered a point of reference, using the concept of alternative modernities in the case of heritage, we can arrive at the conclusion that modern heritage in Africa is a subcategory of Western modern heritage, the core of which has been defined in Europe, and the periphery carries its marks. To liberate this heritage from the modern Western concept, there is a need to reconstruct modernity from an exterior perspective and look to alternatives to modernity. Transmodern heritage evolved in the face of modernity, being simultaneously pre-modern and modern, is not bound by the Western binary of tradition and modernity. Defined through geopolitics of knowledge, it would account for differences between Western and non-Western concepts of heritage, and would be able to contain different conceptualizations of time and space held by people in the exteriority. And I would like to end by recalling here some of the statements made by Professor Achille Mbembe during our previous discussion on modern heritage of Africa. Defining heritage in the African context, he said that heritage is about loss, but most of all, it is about creation of new forms, not about conservation of old forms, but creation of new ones. It is not about returning to some primal scene, reiterating gestures from the past, but creating new forms of life for the future. It is a way of inhabiting the world, and in the process, learning how to take care of one's own times, how to repair one's own times and the world. It is about care of that which is immeasurable, priceless, the life forms and forces. I believe that the category of transmodern heritage can accommodate all of these dimensions of world heritage. Thank you.